Chapter 25 of Wives and Daughters. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 25. Hollingford in a bustle. All Hollingford felt as if there was a great deal to be done before Easter this year. There was Easter proper, which always required new clothing of some kind, for fear of certain consequences from little birds, who were supposed to resent the impiety of those that did not wear some new article of dress on Easter day. And most ladies considered it wiser that the little birds should see the new article for themselves, and not have to take it upon trust, as they would have to do if it were merely a pocket-handkerchief, or a petticoat, or any article of underclothing. So piety demanded a new bonnet, or a new gown, and was barely satisfied with an Easter pair of gloves. Miss Rose was generally very busy just before Easter in Hollingford. Then this year there was the charity ball. Ashcombe, Hollingford, and Coreham were three neighbouring towns, of about the same number of population, lying at the three equidistant corners of a triangle. In imitation of greater cities with their festivals, these three towns had agreed to have an annual ball for the benefit of the county hospital, to be held in turn at each place, and Hollingford was to be the place this year. It was a fine time for hospitality, and every house of any pretension was as full as it could hold, and flys were engaged long months before. If Mrs Gibson could have asked Osborne, or in default Roger Hamley, to go to the ball with them and to sleep at their house, or if, indeed, she could have picked up any stray scion of a county family to whom such an offer would have been a convenience, she would have restored her own dressing-room to its former use as the spare-room with pleasure. But she did not think it was worth her while to put herself out for any of the humdrum and ill-dressed women who had been her former acquaintances at Ashcombe. For Mr Preston it might have been worth while to give up her room, considering him in the light of a handsome and prosperous young man, and a good dancer besides. But there were more lights in which he was to be viewed. Mr Gibson, who really wanted to return the hospitality shown to him by Mr Preston at the time of his marriage, had yet an instinctive distaste to the man, which no wish of freeing himself from obligation, nor even the more worthy feeling of hospitality could overcome. Mrs Gibson had some old grudges of her own against him, but she was not one to retain angry feelings, or be very active in her retaliation. She was afraid of Mr Preston, and admired him at the same time. It was awkward, too, so she said, to go into a ball-room without any gentleman at all, and Mr Gibson was so uncertain. On the whole, partly for this last given reason, and partly because conciliation was the best policy, Mrs Gibson was slightly in favour of inviting Mr Preston to be their guest. But as soon as Cynthia heard the question discussed, or rather as soon as she heard it discussed in Mr Gibson's absence, she said that if Mr Preston came to be their visitor on the occasion, she for one would not go to the ball at all. She did not speak with vehemence or in anger, but with such quiet resolution that Molly looked up in surprise. She saw that Cynthia was keeping her eyes fixed on her work, and that she had no intention of meeting any one's gaze, or giving any further explanation. Mrs Gibson, too, looked perplexed, and once or twice seemed on the point of asking some question, but she was not angry, as Molly had fully expected. She watched Cynthia furtively and in silence for a minute or two, and then said that, after all, she could not conveniently give up her dressing-room, and altogether they had better say no more about it. So no stranger was invited to stay at Mr Gibson's at the time of the ball, but Mrs Gibson spoke openly of her regret at the unavoidable inhospitality, and hoped that they might be able to build an addition to their house before the next triennial Hollingford ball. Another cause of unusual bustle at Hollingford this Easter was the expected return of the family to the Towers, after their unusually long absence. Mr Sheepshanks might be seen trotting up and down on his stout old cob, speaking to attentive masons, plasterers, and glaziers about putting everything, on the outside at least, about the cottages belonging to "my lord" in perfect repair. Lord Cumnor owned the greater part of the town, and those who lived under other landlords, or in houses of their own, were stirred up by the dread of contrast to do up their dwellings. So the ladders of whitewashers and painters were sadly in the way of the ladies tripping out in these days. The housekeeper and steward from the Towers might also be seen coming in to give orders at the various shops, and stopping here and there at those kept by favourites, to avail themselves of the eagerly tendered refreshments. Lady Harriet came to call on her old governess the day after the arrival of the family at the Towers. Molly and Cynthia were out walking when she came, doing some errands for Mrs Gibson, who had a secret idea that Lady Harriet would call at the particular time she did, and had a not uncommon wish to talk to her ladyship without the corrective presence of any member of her own family. Mrs Gibson did not give Molly the message of remembrance that Lady Harriet had left for her, but she imparted various pieces of news relating to the Towers with great animation and interest. The Duchess of Menteith and her daughter Lady Alice were coming to the Towers, would be there the day of the ball, would come to the ball, and the Menteith diamonds were famous. That was piece of news the first. The second was that ever so many gentlemen were coming to the Towers, some English, some French. This piece of news would have come first in order of importance, had there been much probability of their being dancing men, and, as such, possible partners at the coming ball. But Lady Harriet had spoken of them as Lord Hollingford's friends, useless scientific men in all probability. Then, finally, Mrs Gibson was to go to the Towers next day to lunch. Lady Cumnor had written a little note by Lady Harriet to beg her to come. If Mrs Gibson could manage to find her way to the Towers, one of the carriages in use should bring her back to her own house in the course of the afternoon. "The dear Countess," said Mrs Gibson with soft affection. It was a soliloquy, uttered after a minute's pause, at the end of all this information. And all the rest of that day her conversation had an aristocratic perfume hanging about it. One of the few books she had brought with her into Mr Gibson's house was bound in pink, and in it she studied Menteith, Duke of, Adolphus George, etc., etc., till she was fully up in all the Duchess's connections and probable interests. Mr Gibson made his mouth up into a droll whistle when he came home at night, and found himself in a Towers atmosphere. Molly saw the shade of annoyance through the drollery. She was beginning to see it oftener than she liked. Not that she reasoned upon it, or that she consciously traced the annoyance to its source, but she could not help feeling uneasy in herself when she knew her father was in the least put out. Of course a fly was ordered for Mrs Gibson. In the early afternoon she came home. If she had been disappointed in her interview with the Countess, she never told her woe, nor revealed the fact that when she first arrived at the Towers, she had to wait for an hour in Lady Cumnor's morning-room, uncheered by any companionship save that of her old friend Mrs Bradley, till suddenly, Lady Harriet coming in, she exclaimed, "Why, Clare, you dear woman, are you here all alone? Does mamma know?" And after a little more affectionate conversation, she rushed to find her ladyship, who was perfectly aware of the fact, but too deep in giving the Duchess the benefit of her wisdom and experience in trousseau to be at all aware of the length of time Mrs Gibson had been passing in patient solitude. At lunch Mrs Gibson was secretly hurt by my lord supposing it to be her dinner, and calling out his urgent hospitality from the very bottom of the table, giving as a reason for it that she must remember it was her dinner. In vain she piped out in her soft high voice, "Oh, my lord, I never eat meat in the middle of the day. I can hardly eat anything at lunch." Her voice was lost, and the Duchess might go away with the idea that the Hollingford doctor's wife dined early, that is to say, if her Grace ever condescended to have any idea on the subject at all, which presupposes that she was cognizant of the fact of there being a doctor at Hollingford, and that he had a wife, and that his wife was the pretty, faded, elegant-looking woman sending away her plate of untasted food which she longed to eat, for she really was desperately hungry after her drive and her solitude. And then, after her lunch, there did come a tête-à-tête with Lady Cumnor, which was conducted after this wise. "Well, Clare, I am really glad to see you. I once thought I should never get back to the Towers, but here I am. There was such a clever man at Bath, a Dr. Snape. He cured me at last, quite set me up. I really think if I am ever ill again, I shall send for him. It is such a thing to find a really clever medical man. Oh, by the way, I always forget you've married Mr. Gibson. Of course he is very clever and all that. The carriage to the door in 10 minutes, Brown, and desire Bradley to bring my things down. What was I asking you? Oh, how do you get on with the stepdaughter? She seemed to me a young lady with a pretty stubborn will of her own. I put a letter for the post down somewhere, and I cannot think where. Do help me look for it, there's a good woman. Just run to my room and see if Brown can find it, for it is of great consequence." Off went Mrs. Gibson rather unwillingly, for there were several things she wanted to speak about, and she had not heard half of what she had expected to learn of the family gossip. But all chance was gone, for when she came back from her fruitless errand, Lady Cumnor and the Duchess were in full talk, Lady Cumnor with the missing letter in her hand, which she was using something like a baton to enforce her words. "Every iota from Paris, every iota." Lady Cumnor was too much of a lady not to apologize for useless trouble, but they were nearly the last words she spoke to Mrs. Gibson, for she had to go out and drive with the Duchess, and the brougham to take Clare, as she persisted in calling Mrs. Gibson, back to Hollingford followed the carriage to the door. Lady Harriet came away from her entourage of young men and young ladies, all prepared for some walking expedition, to wish Mrs. Gibson good-bye. "We shall see you at the ball," she said. "You'll be there with your two girls, of course, and I must have a little talk with you there. With all these visitors in the house, it has been impossible to see anything of you to-day, you know." Such were the facts, but rose-colour was the medium through which they were seen by Mrs. Gibson's household listeners on her return. "There are many visitors staying at the Towers. Oh yes, a great many. The Duchess and Lady Alice, and Mr. and Mrs. Grey, and Lord Albert Monson and his sister, and my old friend Captain James of the Blues, many more in fact. But of course I preferred going to Lady Cumnor's own room, where I could see her and Lady Harriet quietly, and where we were not disturbed by the bustle downstairs. Of course we were obliged to go down to lunch, and then I saw my old friends, and renewed pleasant acquaintances. But I really could hardly get any connected conversation with any one. Lord Cumnor seemed so delighted to see me there again, though there were 6 or 7 between us, and he was always interrupting with some civil or kind speech especially addressed to me. And after lunch Lady Cumnor asked me all sorts of questions about my new life, with as much interest as if I had been her daughter. To be sure, when the Duchess came in we had to leave off, and talk about the trousseau she is preparing for Lady Alice. Lady Harriet made such a point of our meeting at the ball. She is such a good, affectionate creature, is Lady Harriet." This last was said in a tone of meditative appreciation. The afternoon of the day on which the ball was to take place, a servant rode over from Hamley with 2 lovely nosegays, "with the Mr. Hamley's compliments to Miss Gibson and Miss Kirkpatrick." Cynthia was the first to receive them. She came dancing into the drawing-room, flourishing the flowers about in either hand, and danced up to Molly, who was trying to settle to her reading, by way of passing the time away till the evening came. "Look, Molly, look! Here are bouquets for us. Long life to the givers." "Who are they from?" asked Molly, taking hold of one, and examining it with tender delight at its beauty. "Who from? Why, the 2 paragons of Hamleys, to be sure. Is it not a pretty attention?" "How kind of them," said Molly. "I am sure it is Osborne who thought of it. He has been so much abroad, where it is such a common compliment to send bouquets to young ladies." "I don't see why I should think it is Osborne's thought," said Molly, reddening a little. "Mr. Roger Hamley used to gather nosegays constantly for his mother, and sometimes for me." "Well, never mind whose thought it was, or who gathered them. We've got the flowers, and that's enough. Molly, I'm sure these red flowers will just match your coral necklace and bracelets," said Cynthia, pulling out some camellias, then a rare kind of flower. "Oh, please don't!" exclaimed Molly. "Don't you see how carefully the colours are arranged? They've taken such pains. Please don't." "Nonsense!" said Cynthia, continuing to pull them out. "See, here are quite enough. I'll make you a little coronet of them, sewn on black velvet, which will never be seen, just as they do in France." "Oh, I am so sorry, it is quite spoilt," said Molly. "Never mind, I'll take this spoilt bouquet. I can make it up again just as prettily as ever, and you shall have this, which has never been touched." Cynthia went on arranging the crimson buds and flowers to her taste. Molly said nothing, but kept watching Cynthia's nimble fingers tying up the wreath. "There," said Cynthia at last. "When that is sewn on black velvet to keep the flowers from dying, you'll see how pretty it will look. And there are enough red flowers in this untouched nosegay to carry out the idea." "Thank you," very slowly. "But shan't you mind having only the wrecks of the other?" "Not I. Red flowers would not go with my pink dress." "But I dare say they arranged each nosegay so carefully." "Perhaps they did, but I never would allow sentiment to interfere with my choice of colours, and pink does tie one down. Now you, in white muslin just tipped with crimson, like a daisy, may wear anything." Cynthia took the utmost pains in dressing Molly, leaving the clever housemaid to her mother's exclusive service. Mrs. Gibson was more anxious about her attire than was either of the girls. It had given her occasion for deep thought and not a few sighs. Her deliberation had ended in her wearing her pearl-grey satin wedding-gown, with a profusion of lace, and white and coloured lilacs. Cynthia was the one who took the affair most lightly. Molly looked upon the ceremony of dressing for a first ball as rather a serious ceremony, certainly as an anxious proceeding. Cynthia was almost as anxious as herself, only Molly wanted her appearance to be correct and unnoticed, and Cynthia was desirous of setting off Molly's rather peculiar charms, her cream-coloured skin, her profusion of curly black hair, her beautiful long-shaped eyes, with their shy, loving expression. Cynthia took up so much time in dressing Molly to her mind, that she herself had to perform her toilette in a hurry. Molly, ready dressed, sat on a low chair in Cynthia's room, watching the pretty creature's rapid movements, as she stood in her petticoat before the glass, doing up her hair, with quick certainty of effect. At length Molly heaved a sigh, and said, "I should like to be pretty." "Why, Molly," said Cynthia, turning round with an exclamation on the tip of her tongue, but when she caught the innocent wistful look on Molly's face, she instinctively checked what she was going to say, and half smiling to her own reflection in the glass, she said, "The French girls would tell you, to believe that you were pretty would make you so." Molly paused before replying. "I suppose they would mean that if you knew you were pretty, you would never think about your looks. You would be so certain of being liked, and that it is caring. Listen, that's 8 o'clock striking. Don't trouble yourself with trying to interpret a French girl's meaning, but help me on with my frock, there's a dear one." The two girls were dressed, and were standing over the fire waiting for the carriage in Cynthia's room, when Maria, Betty's successor, came hurrying into the room. Maria had been officiating as maid to Mrs Gibson, but she had had intervals of leisure, in which she had rushed upstairs, and under the pretence of offering her services, had seen the young ladies' dresses, and the sight of so many nice clothes had sent her into a state of excitement which made her think of nothing of rushing upstairs for the 20th time, with a nosegay still more beautiful than the 2 previous ones. "Here, Miss Kirkpatrick! No, it's not for you, miss," as Molly, being nearer to the door, offered to take it and pass it to Cynthia. "It's for Miss Kirkpatrick, and there's a note for her besides." Cynthia said nothing, but took the note and the flowers. She held the note so that Molly could read it at the same time she did. "I send you some flowers, and you must allow me to claim the first dance after 9 o'clock, before which time I fear I cannot arrive. R.P." "Who is it?" asked Molly. Cynthia looked extremely irritated, indignant, perplexed. What was it turned her cheek so pale, and made her eyes so full of fire? "It is Mr. Preston," said she in answer to Molly. "I shall not dance with him, and here go his flowers," into the very middle of the embers, which she immediately stirred down upon the beautiful shrivelling petals, as if she wished to annihilate them as soon as possible. Her voice had never been raised, it was as sweet as usual, nor, though her movements were prompt enough, were they hasty or violent. "Oh," said Molly, "those beautiful flowers! We might have put them in water." "No," said Cynthia, "it's best to destroy them. We don't want them, and I can't bear to be reminded of that man." "It was an impertinent familiar note," said Molly. "What right had he to express himself in that way? No beginning, no end, and only initials. Did you know him well when you were at Ashcombe, Cynthia?" "Oh, don't let us think any more about him," replied Cynthia. "It is quite enough to spoil any pleasure at the ball to think that he will be there. But I hope I shall get engaged before he comes, so that I can't dance with him, and don't you either." "There, they are calling for us," exclaimed Molly, and with quick step, yet careful of their draperies, they made their way downstairs to the place where Mr. and Mrs. Gibson awaited them. Yes, Mr. Gibson was going, even if he had to leave them afterwards to attend to any professional call. And Molly suddenly began to admire her father as a handsome man, when she saw him now in full evening attire. Mrs. Gibson, too, how pretty she was! In short, it was true that no better-looking a party than these 4 people entered the Hollingford ballroom that evening. End of chapter 25. Wives and Daughters. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 26. A Charity Ball. At the present time there are few people at a public ball besides the dancers and their chaperons, or relations in some degree interested in them. But in the days when Molly and Cynthia were young, Before railroads were, and before their consequences, the excursion trains, which take every one up to London nowadays, there to see their fill of gay crowds and fine dresses, to go to an annual charity ball, even though all thought of dancing had passed by years ago, and without any of the responsibilities of a chaperone, was a very allowable and favourite piece of dissipation to all the kindly old maids who thronged the country towns of England. They aired their old lace and their best dresses, they saw the aristocratic magnates of the countryside, they gossiped with their coevals, and speculated on the romances of the young around them in a curious yet friendly spirit. The Miss Brownings would have thought themselves sadly defrauded of the gayest event of the year if anything had prevented their attending the charity ball, and Miss Browning would have been indignant, Miss Phoebe aggrieved, had they not been asked to Ashcombe and Coreham by friends at each place, who had, like them, gone through the dancing stage of life some 25 years before, but who liked still to haunt the scenes of their former enjoyment, and see a younger generation dance on regardless of their doom. They had come in one of the 2 sedan chairs that yet lingered in use at Hollingford. Such a night as this brought a regular harvest of gains to the 2 old men, who, in what was called the town's livery, trotted backwards and forwards with their many loads of ladies and finery. There were some post-chaises and some flies, but after mature deliberation Miss Browning had decided to keep to the more comfortable custom of the sedan chair, which, as she said to Miss Piper, one of her visitors, came into the parlour and got full of the warm air and nipped you up and carried you tight and cosy into another warm room where you could walk out without having to show your legs by going up steps or down steps. Of course, only one could go at a time, but here again a little of Miss Browning's good management arranged everything so very nicely, as Miss Hornblower, their other visitor, remarked. She went first, and remained in the warm cloak-room until her hostess followed, and then the 2 ladies went arm in arm into the ballroom, finding out convenient seats whence they could watch the arrivals and speak to their passing friends, until Miss Phoebe and Miss Piper entered and came to take possession of the seats reserved for them by Miss Browning's care. These 2 younger ladies came in also arm in arm, but with a certain timid flurry in look and movement very different from the composed dignity of their seniors, by 2 or 3 years. When all 4 were once more assembled together, they took a breath and began to converse. "Upon my word, I really do think this is a better room than our Ashcombe Court-house." "And how prettily it is decorated," piped out Miss Piper. "How well the roses are made! But you all have such taste at Hollingford." "There's Mrs. Dempster," cried Miss Hornblower. "She said she and her 2 daughters were asked to stay at Mr. Sheepshanks'. Mr. Preston was to be there too, but I suppose they could not all come at once. Look, and there is young Roscoe, our new doctor. I declare it seems as if all Ashcombe were here. Mr. Roscoe! Mr. Roscoe! Come here, and let me introduce you to Miss Browning, the friend we are staying with. We think very highly of our young doctor, I can assure you, Miss Browning." Mr. Roscoe bowed and simpered at hearing his own praises, but Miss Browning had no notion of having any doctor praised, who had come to settle on the very verge of Mr. Gibson's practice, so she said to Miss Hornblower, "You must be very glad, I am sure, to have somebody you can call in, if you are in any sudden hurry, or for things that are too trifling to trouble Mr. Gibson about, and I should think Mr. Roscoe would feel it a great advantage to profit, as he will naturally have the opportunity of doing, by witnessing Mr. Gibson's skill." Probably Mr. Roscoe would have felt more aggrieved by this speech than he really was, if his attention had not been called off just then by the entrance of the very Mr. Gibson who was being spoken of. Almost before Miss Browning had ended her severe and depreciatory remarks, he had asked his friend Miss Hornblower, "Who is that lovely girl in pink just come in?" "Why, that's Cynthia Kirkpatrick," said Miss Hornblower, taking up a ponderous gold eyeglass to make sure of her fact. "How she has grown! To be sure, it is 2 or 3 years since she left Ashcombe. She was very pretty then. People did say Mr. Preston admired her very much, but she was so young." "Can you introduce me?" asked the impatient young surgeon. "I should like to ask her to dance." When Miss Hornblower returned from greeting to her former acquaintance, Mrs. Gibson, and had accomplished the introduction which Mr. Roscoe had requested, she began her little confidences to Miss Browning.
Well, to be sure, how condescending we are! I remember the time when Mrs. Kirkpatrick wore old black silks, and was thankful and civil as became her place as a schoolmistress, and as having to earn her bread. And now she is in satin, and she speaks to me as if she could just recollect who I was, if she tried very hard. It isn't so long ago since Mrs. Dempster came to consult me as to whether Mrs. Kirkpatrick would be offended if she sent her a new breadth for her lilac silk gown, in place of one that had been spoilt by Mrs. Dempster's servant spilling the coffee over it the night before, and she took it and was thankful, for all she's dressed in pearl grey satin now, and she would have been glad enough to marry Mr. Preston in those days."
"I thought you said he admired her daughter," put in Miss Browning to her irritated friend.
"Well, perhaps I did, and perhaps it was so. I'm sure I can't tell. He was a great deal at the house. Miss Dixon keeps a school in the same house now, and I'm sure she does it a great deal better."
"The Earl and the Countess are very fond of Mrs. Gibson," said Miss Browning. "I know, for Lady Harriet told us when she came to drink tea with us last autumn, and they desired Mr. Preston to be very attentive to her when she lived at Ashcombe."
"For goodness' sake, don't go and repeat what I've been saying about Mr. Preston and Mrs. Kirkpatrick to her ladyship. One may be mistaken, and you know I only said people talked about it."
Miss Hornblower was evidently alarmed lest her gossip should be repeated to Lady Harriet, who appeared to be on such an intimate footing with her Hollingford friends. Nor did Miss Browning dissipate the illusion. Lady Harriet had drunk tea with them, and might do it again, and at any rate the little fright she had put her friend into was not a bad return for that praise of Mr. Roscoe which had offended Miss Browning's loyalty to Mr. Gibson. Meanwhile Miss Piper and Miss Phoebe, who had not the character of esprit fort to maintain, talked of the dresses of the people present, beginning by complimenting each other.
"What a lovely turban you have got on, Miss Piper, if I may be allowed to say so, so becoming to your complexion."
"Do you think so?" said Miss Piper, with ill-concealed gratification. It was something to have a complexion at 45.
"I got it at Brown's, at Somerton, for this very ball. I thought I must have something to set off my gown, which isn't quite so new as it once was, and I have no handsome jewellery like you,"
looking with admiring eyes at a large miniature set round with pearls, which served as a shield to Miss Phoebe's breast.
"It is handsome," that lady replied. "It is a likeness of my dear mother. Dorothy has got my father on. The miniatures were both taken at the same time, and just about then my uncle died and left us each a legacy of £50, which we agreed to spend on the setting of our miniatures. But because they are so valuable, Dorothy always keeps them locked up with the best silver, and hides the box somewhere. She never will tell me where, because she says I've such weak nerves, and that if a burglar with a loaded pistol at my head were to ask me where we kept our plate and jewels, I should be sure to tell him. And she says, for her part, she would never think of revealing under any circumstances. I'm sure I hope she won't be tried. But that's the reason I don't wear it often. It's only the second time I've had it on, and I can't even get at it and look at it, which I should like to do. I shouldn't have had it on to-night, but that Dorothy gave it out to me, saying it was but a proper compliment to pay to the Duchess of Menteith, who is to be here in all her diamonds." "Dear, ah me, is she really? Do you know, I never saw a duchess before."
And Miss Piper drew herself up and craned her neck, as if resolved to behave herself properly, as she had been taught to do at boarding-school 30 years before, in the presence of her Grace. By and by she said to Miss Phoebe, with a sudden jerk out of position,
"Look, look, that's our Mr. Cholmley, the magistrate."
He was the great man of Coram.
"And that's Mrs. Cholmley in red satin, and Mr. George and Mr. Harry from Oxford, I do declare, and Miss Cholmley and pretty Miss Sophie. I should like to go and speak to them, but then it's so formidable crossing a room without a gentleman. And there is Cox, the butcher, and his wife. Why, all Coram seems to be here. And how Mrs. Cox can afford such a gown, I can't make out for one, for I know Cox has had some difficulty in paying for the last sheep he bought of my brother."
Just at this moment the band, consisting of 2 violins, a harp, and an occasional clarinet, having finished their tuning, and brought themselves as nearly into accord as was possible, struck up a brisk country dance, and partners quickly took their places. Mrs. Gibson was secretly a little annoyed at Cynthia's being one of those to stand up in this early dance, the performers in which were principally the punctual plebeians of Hollingford, who, when a ball was fixed to begin at 8, had no notion of being later, and so losing part of the amusement for which they had paid their money. She imparted some of her feelings to Molly, sitting by her, longing to dance, and beating time to the spirited music with one of her pretty little feet. "Your dear papa is always so very punctual. To-night it seems almost a pity, for we really are here before there is any one come that we know." "Oh, I see so many people here that I know. There are Mr. and Mrs. Smeaton, and that nice good-tempered daughter." "Oh, booksellers and butchers, if you will." "Papa has found a great many friends to talk to." "Patience, my dear, hardly friends. There are some nice-looking people here," catching her eye on the Cholmleys, "but I dare say they have driven over from the neighbourhood of Ashcombe or Coreham, and have hardly calculated how soon they would get here. I wonder when the Towers party will come. Ah, there's Mr. Ashton and Mr. Preston. Come, the room is beginning to fill."
So it was, for this was to be a very good ball, people said, and a large party from the Towers was coming, and a duchess in diamonds among the number. Every great house in the district was expected to be full of guests on these occasions, but at this early hour the townspeople had the floor almost entirely to themselves. The county magnates came dropping in later, and chiefest among them all was the Lord Lieutenant from the Towers. But to-night they were unusually late, and the aristocratic ozone being absent from the atmosphere, there was a flatness about the dancing of all those who considered themselves above the plebeian ranks of the tradespeople. They, however, enjoyed themselves thoroughly, and sprang and bounded till their eyes sparkled and their cheeks glowed with exercise and excitement. Some of the more prudent parents, mindful of the next day's duties, began to consider at what hour they ought to go home, but with all there was an expressed or unexpressed curiosity to see the Duchess and her diamonds, for the Menteith diamonds were famous in higher circles than that now assembled, and their fame had trickled down to it through the medium of ladies' maids and housekeepers. Mr. Gibson had had to leave the ballroom for a time, as he had anticipated, but he was to return to his wife as soon as his duties were accomplished, and in his absence Mrs. Gibson kept herself a little aloof from the Miss Brownings and those of her acquaintance who would willingly have entered into conversation with her, with the view of attaching herself to the skirts of the Towers party when they should make their appearance. If Cynthia would not be so very ready in engaging herself to every possible partner who asked her to dance, there were sure to be young men staying at the Towers who would be on the look-out for pretty girls, and who could tell to what a dance might lead? Molly, too, though not so good a dancer as Cynthia, and from her timidity less graceful and easy, was becoming engaged pretty deeply, and it must be confessed she was longing to dance every dance, no matter with whom. Even she might not be available for the more aristocratic partners Mrs. Gibson anticipated. She was feeling very much annoyed with the whole proceedings of the evening, when she was aware of some one standing by her, and turning a little to one side, she saw Mr. Preston keeping guard, as it were, over the seats which Molly and Cynthia had just quitted. He was looking so black that if their eyes had not met, Mrs. Gibson would have preferred not speaking to him. As it was, she thought it unavoidable. "The rooms are not well lighted to-night, are they, Mr. Preston?" "No," said he. "But who could light such dingy old paint as this, loaded with evergreens, too, which always darken a room?" "And the company, too. I always think that freshness and brilliancy of dress go as far as anything to brighten up a room. Look what a set of people are here. The greater part of the women are dressed in dark silks, really only fit for a morning. The place will be quite different by and by, when the county families are in a little more force." Mr. Preston made no reply. He had put his glass in his eye, apparently for the purpose of watching the dancers. If its exact direction could have been ascertained, it would have been found that he was looking intently and angrily at a flying figure in pink muslin. Many a one was gazing at Cynthia with intentness besides himself, but no one in anger. Mrs. Gibson was not so fine an observer as to read all this, but here was a gentlemanly and handsome young man to whom she could prattle, instead of either joining herself on to objectionable people, or sitting all forlorn until the Towers party came. So she went on with her small remarks. "You are not dancing, Mr. Preston?" "No. The partner I had engaged has made some mistake. I am waiting to have an explanation with her." Mrs. Gibson was silent. An uncomfortable tide of recollections appeared to come over her. She, like Mr. Preston, watched Cynthia. The dance was ended, and she was walking round the room in easy unconcern as to what might await her. Presently her partner, Mr. Harry Cholmley, brought her back to her seat. She took that vacant next to Mr. Preston, leaving the one by her mother for Molly's occupation.
The latter returned a moment afterwards to her place. Cynthia seemed entirely unconscious of Mr. Preston's neighbourhood. Mrs. Gibson leaned forwards and said to her daughter, "Your last partner was a gentleman, my dear. You are improving in your selection. I really was ashamed of you before, figuring away with that attorney's clerk. Molly, do you know who you have been dancing with? I have found out he is the Cornhill bookseller." "That accounts for his being so well up in all the books I've been wanting to hear about," said Molly eagerly, but with a little spice of malice in her mind. "He really was very pleasant, mamma," she added, "and he looks quite a gentleman, and dances beautifully." "Very well, but remember if you go on this way you will have to shake hands over the counter to-morrow morning with some of your partners of to-night," said Mrs. Gibson coldly. "But I really don't know how to refuse when people are introduced to me and ask me, and I am longing to dance. You know to-night is a charity ball, and papa said everybody danced with everybody," said Molly, in a pleading tone of voice, for she could not quite thoroughly enjoy herself if she was out of harmony with any one. What reply Mrs. Gibson would have made to this speech cannot now be ascertained, for before she could answer, Mr. Preston stepped a little forwards, and said, in a tone which he meant to be icily indifferent, but which trembled with anger, "If Miss Gibson finds any difficulty in refusing a partner, she has only to apply to Miss Kirkpatrick for instructions." Cynthia lifted up her beautiful eyes, and fixing them on Mr. Preston's face, said very quietly, as if only stating a matter of fact, "You forget, I think, Mr. Preston. Miss Gibson implied that she wished to dance with the person who asked her. That makes all the difference. I can't instruct her how to act in that difficulty." And to the rest of this little conversation Cynthia appeared to lend no ear, and she was almost directly claimed by her next partner. Mr. Preston took the seat now left empty, much to Molly's annoyance. At first she feared lest he might be going to ask her to dance, but instead he put out his hand for Cynthia's nosegay, which she had left on rising, entrusted to Molly. It had suffered considerably from the heat of the room, and was no longer full and fresh, not so much so as Molly's, which had not, in the first instance, been pulled to pieces in picking out the scarlet flowers which now adorned Molly's hair, and which had been since cherished with more care. Enough, however, remained of Cynthia's to show very distinctly that it was not the one Mr. Preston had sent, and it was perhaps to convince himself of this that he rudely asked to examine it. But Molly, faithful to what she imagined would be Cynthia's wish, refused to allow him to touch it. She only held it a little nearer. "Miss Kirkpatrick has not done me the honour of wearing the bouquet I sent her, I see. She received it, I suppose, and my note?" "Yes," said Molly, rather intimidated by the tone in which this was said. "But we had already accepted these two nosegays." Mrs. Gibson was just the person to come to the rescue with her honeyed words on such an occasion as the present. She evidently was rather afraid of Mr. Preston, and wished to keep at peace with him. "Oh yes, we were so sorry. Of course I don't mean to say we should be sorry for anyone's kindness, but two such lovely nosegays had been sent from Hamley Hall, you may see how beautiful from what Molly holds in her hand, and they had come before yours, Mr. Preston." "I should have felt honoured if you had accepted of mine, since the young ladies were so well provided for. I was at some pains in selecting the flowers at Green's. I think I may say it was rather more recherché than that of Miss Kirkpatrick's, which Miss Gibson holds so tenderly and securely in her hand." "Oh, because Cynthia would take out the most effective flowers to put in my hair," exclaimed Molly eagerly. "Did she?" said Mr. Preston, with a certain accent of pleasure in his voice, as though he were glad she set so little store by the nosegay, and he walked off to stand behind Cynthia in the quadrille that was being danced, and Molly saw him making her reply to him, against her will, Molly was sure. But somehow his face and manner implied power over her. She looked grave, deaf, indifferent, indignant, defiant, but after a half-whispered speech to Cynthia at the conclusion of the dance, she evidently threw him an impatient consent to what he was asking, for he walked off with a disagreeable smile of satisfaction on his handsome face. All this time the murmurs were spreading at the lateness of the party from the Towers, and person after person came up to Mrs. Gibson, as if she were the accredited authority as to the Earl and Countess's plans. In one sense this was flattering, but then the acknowledgment of common ignorance and wonder reduced her to the level of the inquirers. Mrs. Goodenough felt herself particularly aggrieved. She had had her spectacles on for the last hour and a half, in order to be ready for the sight the very first minute any one from the Towers appeared at the door. "I had a headache," she complained, "and I should have sent my money and never stirred out of doors to-night, for I've seen many of these here balls, and my lord and my lady too, when they were better worth looking at nor than they are now, but every one was talking of the Duchess and her diamonds, and I thought I shouldn't like to be behindhand, and never ha' seen neither the Duchess nor her diamonds, so I'm here, and coal and candlelight wasting away at home, for I told Sally to sit up for me, and above everything I cannot abide waste. I took it from my mother, who was such a one against waste as you never see nowadays. She was a manager, if ever there was one, and brought up 9 children on less than any one else could do, I'll be bound. Why, she wouldn't let us be extravagant, not even in the matter of colds. Whenever any on us had a pretty bad cold, she took the opportunity and cut our hair, for she said she, it was of no use having 2 colds when one would do, and cutting of our hair was sure to give us a cold. But for all that, I wish the Duchess would come." "Ah, but fancy what it is to me," sighed out Mrs. Gibson, "so long as I have been without seeing the dear family, and seeing so little of them the other day when I was at the Towers, for the Duchess would have my opinion on Lady Alice's trousseau, and kept asking me so many questions it took up all the time, and Lady Harriet's last words were a happy anticipation of our meeting to-night. It's nearly 12 o'clock." Every one of any pretensions to gentility was painfully affected by the absence of the family from the Towers. The very fiddlers seemed unwilling to begin playing a dance that might be interrupted by the entrance of the great folks. Miss Phoebe Browning had apologized for them. Miss Browning had blamed them with calm dignity. It was only the butchers and bakers and candlestick makers who rather enjoyed the absence of restraint, and were happy and hilarious. At last there was a rumbling and a rushing and a whispering, and the music stopped. So the dancers were obliged to do so too, and in came Lord Cumnor in his state dress, with a fat middle-aged woman on his arm. She was dressed almost like a girl, in a sprigged muslin, with natural flowers in her hair, but not a vestige of a jewel or a diamond. Yet it must be the Duchess, but what was a Duchess without diamonds? And in a dress which Farmer Hudson's daughter might have worn. Was it the Duchess? Could it be the Duchess? The little crowd of inquirers around Mrs. Gibson thickened, to hear her confirm their disappointing surmise. After the Duchess came Lady Cumnor, looking like Lady Macbeth in black velvet, a cloud upon her brow, made more conspicuous by the lines of age rapidly gathering on her handsome face; and Lady Harriet and other ladies, amongst whom there was one dressed so like the Duchess as to suggest the idea of a sister rather than a daughter, as far as dress went. There was Lord Hollingford, plain in face, awkward in person, gentlemanly in manner, and half a dozen younger men, Lord Albert Monson, Captain James, and others of their age and standing, who came in looking anything if not critical. This long-expected party swept up to the seats reserved for them at the head of the room, apparently regardless of the interruption they caused, for the dancers stood aside, and almost dispersed back to their seats, and when Money Musk struck up again, not half the former set of people stood up to finish the dance. Lady Harriet, who was rather different to Miss Piper, and no more minded crossing the room alone than if the lookers-on were so many cabbages, spied the Gibson party pretty quickly out, and came across to them. "Here we are at last. How do you do, dear? Why, little one," to Molly, "how nice you're looking. Aren't we shamefully late?" "Oh, it's only just past 12," said Mrs. Gibson, "and I dare say you dined very late." "It wasn't that. It was that ill-mannered woman, who went to her own room after we came out from dinner, and she and Lady Alice stayed there invisible, till we thought they were putting on some splendid attire, as they ought to have done, and at 10:30, when mamma sent up to them to say the carriages were at the door, the Duchess sent down for some beef tea, and at last appeared à l'enfant as you see her. Mamma is so angry with her, and some of the others are annoyed at not coming earlier, and one or two are giving themselves airs about coming at all. Papa is the only one who is not affected by it." Then, turning to Molly, Lady Harriet asked, "Have you been dancing much, Miss Gibson?" "Yes, not every dance, but nearly all." It was a simple question enough, but Lady Harriet's speaking at all to Molly had become to Mrs. Gibson almost like shaking a red rag at a bull. It was the one thing sure to put her out of temper. But she would not have shown this to Lady Harriet for the world, only she contrived to baffle any endeavours at further conversation between the two by placing herself betwixt Lady Harriet and Molly, whom the former asked to sit down in the absent Cynthia's room. "I won't go back to those people, I am so mad with them, and besides, I hardly saw you the other day, and I must have some gossip with you." So she sat down by Mrs. Gibson, and, as Mrs. Goodenough afterwards expressed it, "looked like anybody else." Mrs. Goodenough said this to excuse herself for a little misadventure she fell into. She had taken a deliberate survey of the grandees at the upper end of the room, spectacles on nose, and had inquired, in no very measured voice, who everybody was, from Mr. Sheepshanks, my lord's agent, and her very good neighbour, who in vain tried to check her loud ardour for information by replying to her in whispers. But she was rather deaf as well as blind, so his low tones only brought upon him fresh inquiries. Now, satisfied as far as she could be, and on her way to departure, and the extinguishing of fire and candlelight, she stopped opposite to Mrs. Gibson, and thus addressed her by way of renewal of their former subject of conversation. "Such a shabby thing for a duchess I never saw, not a bit of a diamond near her. They're none of 'em worth looking at except the Countess, and she's always a personable woman, and not so lusty as she was, but they're not worth waiting up for till this time o' night." There was a moment's pause. Then Lady Harriet put her hand out and said, "You don't remember me, but I know you from having seen you at the Towers. Lady Cumnor is a good deal thinner than she was, but we hope her health is better for it." "It's Lady Harriet," said Mrs. Gibson to Mrs. Goodenough, in reproachful dismay. "Dear me, your ladyship, I hope I've given no offence. But you see, that is to say, your ladyship sees, that it's late hours for such folks as me, and I only stayed out of my bed to see the Duchess, and I thought she'd come in diamonds and a coronet, and it puts one out at my age to be so disappointed in the only chance I'm like to have of so fine a sight." "I'm put out too," said Lady Harriet. "I wanted to have come early, and here we are as late as this. I'm so cross and ill-tempered, I should be glad to hide myself in bed as soon as you will do." She said this so sweetly that Mrs. Goodenough relaxed into a smile, and her crabbedness into a compliment. "I don't believe as ever your ladyship can be cross and ill-tempered with that pretty face. I'm an old woman, so you must let me say so." Lady Harriet stood up and made a low curtsy. Then, holding out her hand, she said, "I won't keep you up any longer, but I'll promise one thing in return for your pretty speech. If ever I am a duchess, I'll come and show myself to you in all my robes and gewgaws. Good night, madam." "There, I knew how it would be," said she, not resuming her seat, "and on the eve of a county election, too." "Oh, you must not take old Mrs. Goodenough as a specimen, dear Lady Harriet. She is always a grumbler. I am sure no one else would complain of your being as late as you liked," said Mrs. Gibson. "What do you say, Molly?" said Lady Harriet, turning suddenly her eyes on Molly's face. "Don't you think we've lost some of our popularity, which at this time means votes, by coming so late? Come, answer me. You used to be a famous little truth-teller." "I don't know about popularity or votes," said Molly rather unwillingly. "But I think many people were sorry you did not come sooner, and isn't that rather a proof of popularity?" she added. "That's a very neat and diplomatic answer," said Lady Harriet, smiling, and tapping Molly's cheek with her fan. "Molly knows nothing about it," said Mrs. Gibson, a little off her guard. "It would be very impertinent if she or any one else questioned Lady Cumnor's perfect right to come when she chose." "Well, all I know is, I must go back to mamma now, but I shall make another raid into these regions by and by, and you must keep a place for me. Ah, there are Miss Brownings. You see I don't forget my lesson, Miss Gibson." "Molly, I cannot have you speaking so to Lady Harriet," said Mrs. Gibson, as soon as she was left alone with her stepdaughter. "You would never have known her at all if it had not been for me, and don't always be putting yourself into our conversation." "But I must speak if she asks me questions," pleaded Molly. "Well, if you must, you must, I acknowledge. I'm candid about that at any rate. But there's no need for you to set up to have an opinion at your age." "I don't know how to help it," said Molly. "She's such a whimsical person. Look there, if she's not talking to Miss Phoebe, and Miss Phoebe is so weak she'll easily be led away into fancying she is hand and glove with Lady Harriet. If there is one thing I hate more than another, it is the trying to make out an intimacy with great people." Molly felt innocent enough, so she offered no justification of herself, and made no reply. Indeed, she was more occupied in watching Cynthia. She could not understand the change that seemed to have come over her. She was dancing, it was true, with the same lightness and grace as before, but the smooth bounding motion, as of a feather blown onwards by the wind, was gone. She was conversing with her partner, but without the soft animation that usually shone out upon her countenance. And when she was brought back to her seat, Molly noticed her changed colour, and her dreamily abstracted eyes. "What is the matter, Cynthia?" asked she, in a very low voice. "Nothing," said Cynthia, suddenly looking up, and in an accent of what, in her, was sharpness. "Why should there be?" "I don't know, but you look different to what you did. Tired or something." "There's nothing the matter. Or if it is, don't talk about it. It's all your fancy." This was a rather contradictory speech, to be interpreted by intuition rather than by logic. Molly understood that Cynthia wished for quietness and silence. But what was her surprise, after the speeches that had passed before, and the implication of Cynthia's whole manner to Mr. Preston, to see him come up to her, and without a word offer his arm and lead her away to dance. It appeared to strike Mrs. Gibson as something remarkable, for, forgetting her late passage at arms with Molly, she asked wonderingly, as if almost distrusting the evidence of her senses, "Is Cynthia going to dance with Mr. Preston?" Molly had scarcely time to answer before she herself was led off by her partner. She could hardly attend to him, or to the figures of the quadrille for watching for Cynthia among the moving forms. Once she caught a glimpse of her standing still, downcast, listening to Mr. Preston's eager speech. Again she was walking languidly among the dancers, almost as if she took no notice of those around her. When she and Molly joined each other again, the shade on Cynthia's face had deepened to gloom. But at the same time, if a physiognomist had studied her expression, he would have read in it defiance and anger, and perhaps also a little perplexity. While this quadrille had been going on, Lady Harriet had been speaking to her brother. "Hollingford," she said, laying her hand on his arm, and drawing him a little apart from the well-born crowd amid which he stood, silent and abstracted, "you don't know how these good people here have been hurt and disappointed with our being so late, and with the Duchess's ridiculous simplicity of dress." "Why should they mind it?" asked he, taking advantage of her being out of breath with eagerness. "Oh, don't be so wise and stupid. Don't you see, we're a show and a spectacle. It's like having a pantomime with Harlequin and Columbine in plain clothes." "I don't understand how," he began. "Then take it upon trust. They really are a little disappointed, whether they are logical or not in being so, and we must try and make it up to them. For one thing, because I can't bear our vassals to look dissatisfied and disloyal, and then there's the election in June." "I really would as soon be out of the house as in it." "Nonsense! It would grieve papa beyond measure. But there's no time to talk about that now. You must go and dance with some of the townspeople, and I'll ask Sheepshanks to introduce me to a respectable young farmer. Can't you get Captain James to make himself useful? There he goes with Lady Alice. If I don't get him introduced to the ugliest tailor's daughter I can find for the next dance." She put her arm in her brother's as she spoke, as if to lead him to some partner. He resisted, however, resisted piteously. "Pray don't, Harriet. You know I can't dance. I hate it. I always did. I don't know how to get through a quadrille." "It's a country dance," said she resolutely. "It's all the same. And what shall I say to my partner? I haven't a notion. I shall have no subject in common. Speak of being disappointed, they'll be 10 times more disappointed when they find I can neither dance nor talk." "I'll be merciful, don't be so cowardly. In their eyes a lord may dance like a bear, as some lords not very far from me are, if he likes, and they'll take it for grace. And you shall begin with Molly Gibson, your friend the doctor's daughter. She's a good, simple, intelligent little girl, which you'll think a great deal more of, I suppose, than of the frivolous fact of her being very pretty. Clare, will you allow me to introduce my brother to Miss Gibson? He hopes to engage her for this dance. Lord Hollingford, Miss Gibson." Poor Lord Hollingford! There was nothing for it but for him to follow his sister's very explicit lead, and Molly and he walked off to their places, each heartily wishing their dance together well over. Lady Harriet flew off to Mr. Sheepshanks to secure her respectable young farmer, and Mrs. Gibson remained alone, wishing that Lady Cumnor would send one of her attendant gentlemen for her. It would be so much more agreeable to be sitting even at the fag end of nobility than here on a bench with everybody, hoping that everybody would see Molly dancing away with a lord, yet vexed that the chance had so befallen that Molly instead of Cynthia was the young lady singled out, wondering if simplicity of dress was now become the highest fashion, and pondering on the possibility of cleverly inducing Lady Harriet to introduce Lord Albert Monson to her own beautiful daughter Cynthia. Molly found Lord Hollingford, the wise and learned Lord Hollingford, strangely stupid in understanding the mystery of cross hands and back again, down the middle and up again. He was constantly getting hold of the wrong hands, and as constantly stopping when he had returned to his place, quite unaware that the duties of society and the laws of the dance required that he should go on capering till he had arrived at the bottom of the room. He perceived that he had performed his part very badly, and apologized to Molly when once they had arrived at that haven of comparative peace, and he expressed his regret so simply and heartily that she felt at her ease with him at once, especially when he confided to her his reluctance at having to dance at all, and his only doing it under his sister's compulsion. To Molly he was an elderly widower, almost as old as her father, and by they got into very pleasant conversation. She learned from him that Roger Hamley had just been publishing a paper in some scientific periodical, which had excited considerable attention, as it was intended to confute some theory of a great French physiologist, and Roger's article proved the writer to be possessed of a most unusual amount of knowledge on the subject. This piece of news was of great interest to Molly, and in her questions she herself evinced so much intelligence, and a mind so well prepared for the reception of information, that Lord Hollingford at any rate would have felt his quest of popularity a very easy affair indeed, if he might have gone on talking quietly to Molly during the rest of the evening. When he took her back to her place, he found Mr. Gibson there, and fell into talk with him, until Lady Harriet once more came to him to stir him up to his duties. Before very long, however, he returned to Mr. Gibson's side, and began telling him of this paper of Roger Hamley's, of which Mr. Gibson had not yet heard. In the midst of their conversation, as they stood close by Mrs. Gibson, Lord Hollingford saw Molly in the distance, and interrupted himself to say, "What a charming little lady that daughter of yours is! Most girls of her age are so difficult to talk to, but she is intelligent and full of interest in all sorts of sensible things. Well read, too. She was up in Le Règne Animal, and very pretty." Mr. Gibson bowed, much pleased at such a compliment from such a man, were he lord or not. It is very likely that if Molly had been a stupid listener, Lord Hollingford would not have discovered her beauty, or the converse might be asserted, if she had not been young and pretty, he would not have exerted himself to talk on scientific subjects in a manner which she could understand. But in whatever way Molly had won his approbation and admiration, there was no doubt that she had earned it somehow. And when she next returned to her place, Mrs. Gibson greeted her with soft words and a gracious smile, for it does not require much reasoning power to discover that if it is a very fine thing to be mother-in-law to a very magnificent three-tailed bashaw, it presupposes that the wife who makes the connection between the two parties is in harmony with her mother. And so far had Mrs. Gibson's thoughts wandered into futurity. She only wished that the happy chance had fallen to Cynthia's instead of to Molly's lot. But Molly was a docile, sweet creature, very pretty and remarkably intelligent, as my lord had said. It was a pity that Cynthia preferred making millinery to reading, but perhaps that could be rectified. And there was Lord Cumnor coming to speak to her, and Lady Cumnor nodding to her, and indicating a place by her side. It was not an unsatisfactory ball upon the whole to Mrs. Gibson, although she paid the usual penalty for sitting up beyond her ordinary hour in perpetual glare and movement. The next morning she awoke irritable and fatigued, and a little of the same feeling oppressed both Cynthia and Molly. The former was lounging in the window-seat, holding a 3-days-old newspaper in her hand, which she was making a pretence of reading, when she was startled by her mother's saying, "Cynthia, can't you take up a book and improve yourself? I am sure your conversation will never be worth listening to, unless you read something better than newspapers. Why don't you keep up your French? There was some French book that Molly was reading, Le Règne Animal, I think." "No, I never read it," said Molly, blushing. "Mr. Roger Hamley sometimes read pieces out of it when I was first at the Hall, and told me what it was about." "Oh,
Well, then I suppose I was mistaken. But it comes to all the same thing. Cynthia, you really must learn to settle yourself to some improving reading every morning."
Rather to Molly's surprise, Cynthia did not reply a word, but dutifully went and brought down from among her Boulogne school-books Le Siècle de Louis XIV. But after a while Molly saw that this improving reading was just as much an excuse for Cynthia's thinking her own thoughts as the newspaper had been. End of chapter 26. Wives and Daughters. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. Wives and Daughters, by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 27. Fathers and Sons. Things were not going on any better at Hamley Hall. Nothing had occurred to change the state of dissatisfied feeling into which the squire and his eldest son had respectively fallen, and the long continuance merely of dissatisfaction is sure of itself to deepen the feeling. Roger did all in his power to bring the father and son together, but sometimes wondered if it would not have been better to leave them alone, for they were falling into the habit of each making him their confidant, and so defining emotions and opinions which would have had less distinctness if they had been unexpressed. There was little enough relief in the daily life at the Hall to help them all to shake off the gloom, and it even told on the health of both the squire and Osborne. The squire became thinner, his skin as well as his clothes began to hang loose about him, and the freshness of his colour turned to red streaks, till his cheeks looked like Eardiston pippins, instead of resembling a Catherine pear on the side that's next the sun. Roger thought that his father sat indoors and smoked in his study more than was good for him, but it had become difficult to get him far afield. He was too much afraid of coming across some sign of the discontinued drainage works, or being irritated afresh by the sight of his depreciated timber. Osborne was wrapped up in the idea of arranging his poems for the press, and so working out his wish for independence. What with daily writing to his wife, taking his letters himself to a distant post-office and receiving hers there, touching up his sonnets, etc., with fastidious care, and occasionally giving himself the pleasure of a visit to the Gibsons, and enjoying the society of the two pleasant girls there, he found little time for being with his father. Indeed, Osborne was too self-indulgent, or sensitive, as he termed it, to bear well with the squire's gloomy fits, or too frequent querulousness. The consciousness of his secret, too, made Osborne uncomfortable in his father's presence. It was very well for all parties if Roger was not sensitive, for if he had been, there were times when it would have been too hard to bear little spurts of domestic tyranny, by which his father strove to assert his power over both his sons. One of these occurred very soon after the night of the Hollingford charity ball. Roger had induced his father to come out with him, and the squire had, on his son's suggestion, taken with him his long unused spud. The two had wandered far afield. Perhaps the elder man had found the unwonted length of exercise too much for him, for as he approached the house on his return, he became what nurses call in children fractious, and ready to turn on his companion for every remark he made. Roger understood the case by instinct, as it were, and bore it all with his usual sweetness of temper. They entered the house by the front door. It lay straight on their line of march. On the old cracked yellow marble slab there lay a card with Lord Hollingford's name on it, which Robinson, evidently on the watch for their return, hastened out of his pantry to deliver to Roger. "His lordship was very sorry not to see you, Mr. Roger, and his lordship left a note for you. Mr. Osborne took it, I think, when he passed through. I asked his lordship if he would like to see Mr. Osborne, who was indoors, as I thought, but his lordship said he was pressed for time, and told me to make his excuses." "Didn't he ask for me?" growled the squire. "No, sir, I can't say as his lordship did. He would never have thought of Mr. Osborne, sir, if I hadn't named him. It was Mr. Roger he seemed so keen after." "Very odd," said the squire. Roger said nothing, although he naturally felt some curiosity. He went into the drawing-room, not quite aware that his father was following him. Osborne sat at a table near the fire, pen in hand, looking over one of his poems, and dotting the i's, crossing the t's, and now and then pausing over the alteration of a word. "Oh, Roger," he said, as his brother came in, "here's been Lord Hollingford wanting to see you." "I know," replied Roger. "And he's left a note for you.
Robinson tried to persuade him it was for my father, so he's added a junior, Roger Hamley, Esquire, junior, in pencil."
The squire was in the room by this time, and what he had overheard rubbed him up still more the wrong way. Roger took his unopened note and read it.
"What does he say?" asked the squire.
Roger handed him the note. It contained an invitation to dinner to meet Monsieur Geoffroy St. H., whose views on certain subjects Roger had been advocating in the article Lord Hollingford had spoken about to Molly when he danced with her at the Hollingford ball. Monsieur Geoffroy St. H. was in England now, and was expected to pay a visit at the Towers in the course of the following week. He had expressed a wish to meet the author of the paper which had already attracted the attention of the French comparative anatomists, and Lord Hollingford added a few words as to his own desire to make the acquaintance of a neighbour whose tastes were so similar to his own, and then followed a civil message from Lord and Lady Cumnor. Lord Hollingford's hand was cramped and rather illegible. The squire could not read it all at once, and was enough put out to decline any assistance in deciphering it. At last he made it out.
"So my Lord Lieutenant is taking some notice of the Hamleys at last. The election is coming on, is it? But I can tell him we're not to be got so easily. I suppose this trap is set for you, Osborne. What's this you've been writing that the French Mounseer is so taken with?"
"It is not me, sir," said Osborne. "Both note and call are for Roger."
"I don't understand it," said the squire. "These Whig fellows have never done their duty by me, not that I want it of them. The Duke of Debenham used to pay the Hamleys a respect due to 'em, the oldest landowners in the county, but since he died, and this shabby Whig lord has succeeded him, I've never dined at the Lord Lieutenant's, no, not once."
"But I think, sir, I've heard you say Lord Cumnor used to invite you, only you did not choose to go," said Roger.
"Yes, what do you mean by that? Do you suppose I was going to desert the principles of my family, and curry favour with the Whigs? No, leave that to them. They can ask the heir of the Hamleys fast enough when a county election is coming on."
"I tell you, sir," said Osborne, in the irritable tone he sometimes used when his father was particularly unreasonable, "it is not me Lord Hollingford is inviting, it is Roger. Roger is making himself known for what he is, a first-rate fellow," continued Osborne, a sting of self-reproach mingling with his generous pride in his brother. "And he's getting himself a name. He's been writing about these new French theories and discoveries, and his foreign savant naturally wants to make his acquaintance, and so Lord Hollingford asks him to dine." "It's as clear as can be," lowering his tone, and addressing himself to Roger. "It has nothing to do with politics, if my father would but see it." Of course the squire heard this little aside with the unlucky uncertainty of hearing which is a characteristic of the beginning of deafness, and its effect on him was perceptible in the increased acrimony of his next speech.
"You young men think you know everything. I tell you it's a palpable Whig trick. And what business has Roger, if it is Roger the man wants, to go currying favour with the French? In my day we were content to hate 'em and to lick 'em. But it's just like your conceit, Osborne, setting yourself up to say it's your younger brother they're asking, and not you. I tell you it's you. They think the eldest son was sure to be called after his father, Roger Hamley, junior. It's as plain as a pikestaff. They know they can't catch me with chaff, but they've got up this French dodge. What business had you to go writing about the French, Roger? I should have thought you were too sensible to take any notice of their fancies and theories. But if it is you they've asked, I'll not have you going and meeting these foreigners at a Whig house. They ought to have asked Osborne. He's the representative of the Hamleys, if I'm not, and they can't get me, let 'em try ever so. Besides, Osborne has got a bit of the Mounseer about him, which he caught with being so fond of going off to the Continent, instead of coming back to his good old English home."
He went on repeating much of what he had said before, till he left the room. Osborne had kept on replying to his unreasonable grumblings, which had only added to his anger, and as soon as the squire was fairly gone, Osborne turned to Roger and said, "Of course you'll go, Roger. 10 to 1 he'll be in another mind to-morrow." "No," said Roger, bluntly enough, for he was extremely disappointed. "I won't run the chance of vexing him. I shall refuse." "Don't be such a fool," exclaimed Osborne. "Really, my father is too unreasonable. You heard how he kept contradicting himself, and such a man as you to be kept under like a child by—" "Don't let us talk any more about it, Osborne," said Roger, writing away fast. When the note was written and sent off, he came and put his hand caressingly on Osborne's shoulder, as he sat pretending to read, but in reality vexed with both his father and his brother, though on very different grounds. "How go the poems, old fellow? I hope they're nearly ready to bring out." "No, they're not, and if it weren't for the money I shouldn't care if they were never published. What's the use of fame if one mayn't reap the fruits of it?" "Come now, we'll have no more of that. Let's talk about the money. I shall be going up for my fellowship examination next week, and then we'll have a person common, for they'll never think of not giving me a fellowship now I'm senior wrangler. I'm short enough myself at present, and I don't like to bother my father, but when I'm fellow you shall take me down to Winchester and introduce me to the little wife." "It'll be a month next Monday since I left her," said Osborne, laying down his papers and gazing into the fire, as if by doing so he could call up her image. "In her letter this morning she bids me give you such a pretty message. It won't bear translating into English, you must read it for yourself," continued he, pointing out a line or two in a letter he drew from his pocket. Roger suspected that one or two of the words were wrongly spelt, but their purport was so gentle and loving, and had such a touch of simple, respectful gratitude in them, that he could not help being drawn afresh to the little unseen sister-in-law, whose acquaintance Osborne had made by helping her to look for some missing article of the children's, whom she was taking for their daily walk in Hyde Park. For Mrs Osborne Hamley had been nothing more than a French bonne, very pretty, very graceful, and very much tyrannized over by the rough little boys and girls she had in charge. She was a little orphan girl, who had charmed the heads of a travelling English family, as she had brought Madame some articles of lingerie at an hotel, and she had been hastily engaged by them as bonne to their children, partly as a pet and plaything herself, partly because it would be so good for the children to learn French from a native of Alsace. By and by her mistress ceased to take any particular notice of Aimée in the bustle of London and London gaiety, but, though feeling more and more forlorn in a strange land every day, the French girl strove hard to do her duty. One touch of kindness, however, was enough to set the fountain gushing, and she and Osborne naturally fell into an ideal state of love, to be rudely disturbed by the indignation of the mother, when accident discovered to her the attachment existing between her children's bonne and a young man of an entirely different class. Aimée answered truly to all her mistress's questions, but no worldly wisdom, nor any lesson to be learnt from another's experience, could in the least disturb her entire faith in her lover. Perhaps Mrs Townsend did no more than her duty in immediately sending Aimée back to Metz, where she had first met with her, and where such relations as remained to the girl might be supposed to be residing. But altogether she knew so little of the kind of people or life to which she was consigning her deposed protégée, that Osborne, after listening with impatient indignation to the lecture which Mrs Townsend gave him when he insisted on seeing her in order to learn what had become of his love, that the young man set off straight for Metz in hot haste, and did not let the grass grow under his feet until he had made Aimée his wife. All this had occurred the previous autumn, and Roger did not know of the step his brother had taken until it was irrevocable. Then came the mother's death, which, besides the simplicity of its own overwhelming sorrow, brought with it the loss of the kind, tender mediatrix who could always soften and turn his father's heart. It is doubtful, however, if even she could have succeeded in this, for the squire looked high and over high for the wife of his heir. He detested all foreigners, and overmore held all Roman Catholics in dread and abomination something akin to our ancestors' hatred of witchcraft. All these prejudices were strengthened by his grief. Argument would always have glanced harmless away off his shield of utter unreason, but a loving impulse, in a happy moment, might have softened his heart to what he most detested in the former days. But the happy moments came not now, and the loving impulses were trodden down by the bitterness of his frequent remorse, not less than by his growing irritability, so Aimée lived solitary in the little cottage near Winchester in which Osborne had installed her when she first came to England as his wife, and in the dainty furnishing of which he had run himself so deeply into debt. For Osborne consulted his own fastidious taste in his purchases rather than her simple childlike wishes and wants, and looked upon the little Frenchwoman rather as the future mistress of Hamley Hall than as the wife of a man who was wholly dependent on others at present. He had chosen a southern county as being far removed from those midland shires where the name of Hamley was well and widely known, for he did not wish his wife to assume, if only for a time, a name which was not justly and legally her own. In all these arrangements he had willingly striven to do his full duty by her, and she repaid him with passionate devotion and admiring reverence. If his vanity had met with a check, or his worthy desires for college honours had been disappointed, he knew where to go for a comforter, one who poured out praise till her words were choked in her throat by the rapidity of her thoughts, and who poured out the small vials of her indignation on every one who did not acknowledge and bow down to her husband's merits. If she ever wished to go to the chateau, that was his home, and be introduced to his family, Elaine never hinted a word of it to him. Only she did yearn, and she did plead, for a little more of her husband's company, and the good reasons which had convinced her of the necessity of his being so much away when he was present to urge them, failed in their efficacy when she tried to reproduce them to herself in his absence. The afternoon of the day on which Lord Hollingford called, Roger was going upstairs, 3 steps at a time, when at a turn of the landing he encountered his father. It was the first time he had seen him since their conversation about the Towers' invitation to dinner. The squire stopped his son by standing right in the middle of the passage.
"Thou'rt going to meet the Mounseer, my lad?"
said he, half as affirmation, half as question.
"No, sir. I sent off James almost immediately with a note declining it. I don't care about it, that's to say, not to signify." "Why did you take me up so sharp, Roger?"
said his father pettishly.
"You all take me up so hastily nowadays. I think it's hard when a man mustn't be allowed a bit of crossness when he's tired and heavy at heart, that I do."
"But, father, I should never like to go to a house where they had slighted you."
"Nay, nay, lad," said the squire, brightening up a little. "I think I slighted them. They asked me to dinner after my lord was made lieutenant, time after time, but I would never go near 'em. I call that my slighting them."
And no more was said at the time, but the next day the squire again stopped Roger.
"I've been making Jem try on his livery coat that he hasn't worn this 3 or 4 years. He's got too stout for it now."
"Well, he needn't wear it, need he? And Morgan's lad will be glad enough of it. He's sadly in want of clothes."
"Ay, ay, but who's to go with you when you call at the Towers? It's but polite to call after Lord What's-his-name has taken the trouble to come here, and I shouldn't like you to go without a groom."
"My dear father, I shouldn't know what to do with a man riding at my back. I can find my way to the stable-yard for myself, or there'll be some man about to take my horse. Don't trouble yourself about that."
"Well, you're not Osborne, to be sure. Perhaps it won't strike 'em as strange for you. But you must look up and hold your own, and remember you're one of the Hamleys, who've been on the same land for hundreds of years, while they're but trumpery Whig folk, who only came into the county in Queen Anne's time."
End of chapter 27. Wives and Daughters. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 28. Rivalry. For some days after the ball Cynthia seemed languid and was very silent. Molly, who had promised herself fully as much enjoyment in talking over the past gaiety with Cynthia as in the evening itself, was disappointed when she found that all conversation on the subject was rather evaded than encouraged. Mrs Gibson, it is true, was ready to go over the ground as many times as any one liked, but her words were always like ready-made clothes, and never fitted individual thoughts. Anybody might have used them, and with a change of proper names they might have served to describe any ball. She repeatedly used the same language in speaking about it, till Molly knew the sentences and their sequence even to irritation. "Ah, Mr Osborne, you should have been there. I said to myself how many a time you really should have been there, you and your brother, of course." "I thought of you very often during the evening." "Did you? Now that I call very kind of you. Cynthia, darling, do you hear what Mr Osborne Hamley was saying?" as Cynthia came into the room just then. "He thought of us all on the evening of the ball." "He did better than merely remember us, then," said Cynthia, with her soft, slow smile. "We owe him thanks for those beautiful flowers, mamma." "Oh," said Osborne, "you must not thank me exclusively. I believe it was my thought, but Roger took all the trouble of it." "I consider the thought as everything," said Mrs Gibson. "Thought is spiritual, while action is merely material." This fine sentence took the speaker herself by surprise, and in such conversation as was then going on, it is not necessary to accurately define the meaning of everything that is said. "I'm afraid the flowers were too late to be of much use, though," continued Osborne. "I met Preston the next morning, and of course we talked about the ball. I was sorry to find he had been beforehand with us."
"He only sent one nosegay, and that was for Cynthia," said Molly, looking up from her work. "And it did not come till after we had received the flowers from Hamley."
Molly caught a sight of Cynthia's face before she bent down again to her sewing. It was scarlet in colour, and there was a flash of anger in her eyes. Both she and her mother hastened to speak as soon as Molly had finished, but Cynthia's voice was choked with passion, and Mrs Gibson had the word.
"Mr Preston's bouquet was just one of those formal affairs any one can buy at a nursery garden, which always strike me as having no sentiment in them. I would far rather have 2 or 3 lilies of the valley gathered for me by a person I like, than the most expensive bouquet that could be bought." "Mr Preston had no business to speak as if he had forestalled you," said Cynthia. "It came just as we were ready to go, and I put it into the fire directly."
"Cynthia, my dear love," said Mrs Gibson, who had never heard of the fate of the flowers until now, "what an idea of yourself you will give to Mr Osborne Hamley! But to be sure I can quite understand it. You inherit my feeling, my prejudice, sentimental, I grant, against bought flowers." Cynthia was silent for a moment. Then she said, "I used some of your flowers, Mr Hamley, to dress Molly's hair. It was a great temptation, for the colour so exactly matched her coral ornaments. But I believe she thought it treacherous to disturb the arrangement, so I ought to take all the blame on myself."
"The arrangements was my brother's, as I told you, but I am sure he would have preferred seeing them in Miss Gibson's hair rather than in the blazing fire. Mr Preston comes far the worst off."
Osborne was rather amused at the whole affair, and would have liked to probe Cynthia's motives a little farther. He did not hear Molly saying in as soft a voice as if she were talking to herself, "I wore mine just as they were sent," for Mrs Gibson came in with a total change of subject. "Speaking of lilies of the valley, is it true that they grow wild in Hurst Wood? It is not the season for them to be in flower yet, but when it is, I think we must take a walk there, with our luncheon in a basket, a little picnic, in fact. You'll join us, won't you?" turning to Osborne. "I think it's a charming plan. You could ride to Hollingford and put up your horse there, and we could have a long day in the woods, and all come home to dinner with a basket of lilies in the middle of the table."
"I should like it very much," said Osborne, "but I may not be at home. Roger is more likely to be here, I believe, at that time, a month hence."
He was thinking of the visit to London to sell his poems, and the run down to Winchester which he anticipated afterwards. The end of May had been the period fixed for this pleasure for some time, not merely in his own mind, but in writing to his wife. "Oh, but you must be with us. We must wait for Mr Osborne Hamley, must we not, Cynthia?" "I'm afraid the lilies won't wait," replied Cynthia. "Well, then, we must put it off till dog-rose and honeysuckle time. You will be home then, won't you? Or does the London season present too many attractions?"
"I don't exactly know when dog-roses are in flower."
"Not know? And you a poet? Don't you remember the lines? 'It was the time of roses, we plucked them as we passed.'"
"Yes, but that doesn't specify the time of year that is the time of roses, and I believe my movements are guided more by the lunar calendar than the floral. You had better take my brother for your companion. He is practical in his love of flowers. I am only theoretical."
"Does that fine word theoretical imply that you are ignorant?" asked Cynthia. "Of course we shall be happy to see your brother, but why can't we have you too? I confess to a little timidity in the presence of one so deep and learned as your brother is from all accounts. Give me a little charming ignorance, if one must call it by that hard word."
Osborne bowed. It was very pleasant to him to be petted and flattered, even though he knew all the time that it was only flattery. It was an agreeable contrast to the home that was so dismal to him, to come to this house, where the society of 2 agreeable girls and the soothing syrup of their mother's speeches awaited him whenever he liked to come. To say nothing of the difference that struck upon his senses, poetical though he might esteem himself, of a sitting-room full of flowers and tokens of women's presence, where all the chairs were easy, and all the tables well covered with pretty things, to the great drawing-room at home, where the draperies were threadbare, and the seats uncomfortable, and no sign of feminine presence ever now lent a grace to the stiff arrangement of the furniture. Then the meals, light and well cooked, suited his taste and delicate appetite so much better than the rich and heavy viands prepared by the servants at the Hall. Osborne was becoming a little afraid of falling into the habit of paying too frequent visits to the Gibsons, and that not because he feared the consequences of his intercourse with the two young ladies, for he never thought of them excepting as friends. The fact of his marriage was constantly present to his mind, and Aimée too securely enthroned in his heart, for him to remember that he might be looked upon by others in the light of a possible husband. But the reflection forced itself upon him occasionally, whether he was not trespassing too often on hospitality, which he had at present no means of returning. But Mrs. Gibson, in her ignorance of the true state of affairs, was secretly exultant in the attraction which made him come so often and lounge away the hours in her house and garden. She had no doubt that it was Cynthia who drew him thither, and if the latter had been a little more amenable to reason, her mother would have made more frequent allusions than she did to the crisis which she thought was approaching. But she was restrained by the intuitive conviction that if her daughter became conscious of what was impending, and was made aware of Mrs. Gibson's cautious and quiet efforts to forward the catastrophe, the wilful girl would oppose herself to it with all her skill and power. As it was, Mrs. Gibson trusted that Cynthia's affections would become engaged before she knew where she was, and that in that case she would not attempt to frustrate her mother's delicate scheming, even though she did perceive it. But Cynthia had come across too many varieties of flirtation, admiration, and even passionate love, to be for a moment at fault as to the quiet friendly nature of Osborne's attentions. She received him always as a sister might a brother. It was different when Roger returned from his election as Fellow of Trinity. The trembling diffidence, the hardly suppressed ardour of his manner, made Cynthia understand before long with what kind of love she had now to deal. She did not put it into so many words, no, not even in her secret heart, but she recognized the difference between Roger's relation to her and Osborne's long before Mrs. Gibson found it out. Molly was, however, the first to discover the nature of Roger's attention. The first time they saw him after the ball, it came out to her observant eyes. Cynthia had not been looking well since that evening. She went slowly about the house, pale and heavy-eyed, and fond as she usually was of exercise and the free fresh air, there was hardly any persuading her now to go out for a walk. Molly watched this fading with tender anxiety, but to all her questions as to whether she had felt over-fatigued with her dancing, whether anything had occurred to annoy her, and all such inquiries, she replied in languid negatives. Once Molly touched on Mr. Preston's name, and found that this was a subject on which Cynthia was raw. Now Cynthia's face lighted up with spirit, and her whole body showed her ill-repressed agitation, but she only said a few sharp words, expressive of anything but kindly feeling towards the gentleman, and then bade Molly never name his name to her again. Still the latter could not imagine that he was more than intensely distasteful to her friend, as well as to herself. He could not be the cause of Cynthia's present indisposition. But this indisposition lasted so many days without change or modification that even Mrs. Gibson noticed it, and Molly became positively uneasy. Mrs. Gibson considered Cynthia's quietness and languor as the natural consequence of dancing with everybody who asked her at the ball. Partners whose names were in the red book would not have produced half the amount of fatigue, according to Mrs. Gibson's judgment apparently, and if Cynthia had been quite well, very probably she would have hit the blot in her mother's speech with one of her touches of sarcasm. Then again, when Cynthia did not rally, Mrs. Gibson grew impatient, and accused her of being fanciful and lazy. At length, and partly at Molly's insistence, there came an appeal to Mr. Gibson, and a professional examination of the supposed invalid, which Cynthia hated more than anything, especially when the verdict was that there was nothing very much the matter, only a general lowness of tone and depression of health and spirits, which would soon be remedied by tonics, and meanwhile she was not to be roused to exertion. "If there is one thing that I dislike," said Cynthia to Mr. Gibson, after he had pronounced tonics to be the cure for her present state, "it is the way doctors have of giving tablespoonful of nauseous mixtures as certain remedy for sorrows and cares." She laughed up in his face as she spoke. She had always a pretty word and smile for him, even in the midst of her loss of spirits. "Come, you acknowledge that you have sorrows by that speech. We'll make a bargain. If you'll tell me your sorrows and cares,
I'll try and find some other remedy for them than giving you what we are pleased to term my nauseous mixtures."
"No," said Cynthia, colouring. "I never said I had sorrows and cares. I spoke generally. What should I have a sorrow about? You and Molly are only too kind to me," her eyes filling with tears.
"Well, well, we'll not talk of such gloomy things, and you shall have some sweet emulsion to disguise the taste of the bitters I shall be obliged to fall back upon."
"Please don't. If you but knew how I dislike emulsions and disguises. I do want bitters, and if I'm obliged to, if I'm not truthful myself, I do like truth in others, at least, sometimes."
She ended her sentence with another smile, but it was rather faint and watery. Now the first person out of the house to notice Cynthia's change of look and manner was Roger Hamley, and yet he did not see her until, under the influence of the nauseous mixture, she was beginning to recover. But his eyes were scarcely off her during the first 5 minutes he was in the room. All the time he was trying to talk to Mrs. Gibson in reply to her civil platitudes, he was studying Cynthia; and at the first convenient pause he came and stood before Molly, so as to interpose his person between her and the rest of the room, for some visitors had come in subsequent to his entrance.
"Molly, how ill your sister is looking! What is it? Has she had advice? You must forgive me, but so often those who live together in the same house don't observe the first approaches of illness."
Now Molly's love for Cynthia was fast and unwavering, but if anything tried it, it was the habit Roger had fallen into of always calling Cynthia Molly's sister in speaking to the latter. From any one else it would have been a matter of indifference to her, and hardly to be noticed. It vexed both ear and heart when Roger used the expression, and there was a curtness of manner as well as of words in her reply.
"Oh, she was overtired by the ball. Papa has seen her, and says she will be all right very soon."
"I wonder if she wants change of air," said Roger meditatively. I do wish we could have her at the Hall. You and your mother too, of course. But I don't see how it would be possible, or else how charming it would be."
Molly felt as if a visit to the Hall under such circumstances would be altogether so different an affair to all her former ones, that she could hardly tell if she should like it or not. Roger went on.
"You got our flowers in time, did you not? Ah, you don't know how often I thought of you that evening. And you enjoyed it too, didn't you? You had plenty of agreeable partners, and all that makes a first ball delightful. I heard that your sister danced every dance."
"It was very pleasant," said Molly quietly. "But after all, I'm not sure if I want to go to another just yet. There seems to be so much trouble connected with the ball."
"Ah, you were thinking of your sister, and her not being well."
"No, I was not," said Molly rather bluntly. "I was thinking of the dress, and the dressing, and the weariness the next day."
He might think her unfeeling if he liked. She felt as if she had only too much feeling just then, for it was bringing on her a strange contraction of heart. But he was too inherently good himself to put any harsh construction on her speech. Just before he went away, while he was ostensibly holding her hand and wishing her good-bye, he said to her in a voice too low to be generally heard,
"Is there anything I could do for your sister? We have plenty of books, as you know, if she cares for reading."
Then, receiving no affirmative look or word from Molly in reply to this suggestion, he went on.
"Or flowers? She likes flowers. Oh, and our forced strawberries are just ready. I will bring some over to-morrow."
"I am sure she will like them," said Molly.
For some reason or other unknown to the Gibsons, a longer interval than usual occurred between Osborne's visits, while Roger came almost every day, always with some fresh offering by which he openly sought to relieve Cynthia's indisposition as far as it lay in his power. Her manner to him was so gentle and gracious that Mrs. Gibson became alarmed, lest, in spite of his uncouthness, as she was pleased to term it, he might come to be preferred to Osborne, who was so strangely neglecting his own interests, in Mrs. Gibson's opinion. In her quiet way she contrived to pass many slights upon Roger, but the darts rebounded from his generous nature that could not have imagined her motives, and fastened themselves on Molly. She had often been called naughty and passionate when she was a child, and she thought now that she began to understand that she really had a violent temper. What seemed neither to hurt Roger nor annoy Cynthia made Molly's blood boil, and now she had once discovered Mrs. Gibson's wish to make Roger's visits shorter and less frequent, she was always on the watch for indications of this desire. She read her stepmother's heart when the latter made allusions to the squire's loneliness, now that Osborne was absent from the Hall, and that Roger was so often away amongst his friends during the day.
Mr. Gibson and I should be so delighted if you could have stopped to dinner, but of course we cannot be so selfish as to ask you to stay, when we remember how your father would be left alone. We were saying yesterday we wondered how he bore his solitude. Poor old gentleman.
Or, as soon as Roger came with his bunch of early roses, it was desirable for Cynthia to go and rest in her own room, while Molly had to accompany Mrs. Gibson on some improvised errand or call. Still Roger, whose object was to give pleasure to Cynthia, and who had, from his boyhood, been always certain of Mr. Gibson's friendly regard, was slow to perceive that he was not wanted. If he did not see Cynthia, that was his loss. At any rate, he heard how she was, and left her some little thing which he believed she would like, and was willing to risk the chance of his own gratification by calling 4 or 5 times in the hope of seeing her once. At last there came a day when Mrs. Gibson went beyond her usual negative snubbiness, and when, in some unwonted fit of crossness, for she was a very placid-tempered person in general, she was guilty of positive rudeness. Cynthia was very much better. Tonics had ministered to a mind diseased, though she hated to acknowledge it. Her pretty bloom and much of her light-heartedness had come back, and there was no cause remaining for anxiety. Mrs. Gibson was sitting at her embroidery in the drawing-room, and the 2 girls were at the window, Cynthia laughing at Molly's earnest endeavours to imitate the French accent in which the former had been reading a page of Voltaire. For the duty or the farce of settling to improving reading in the mornings was still kept up, although Lord Hollingford, the unconscious suggester of the idea, had gone back to town without making any of the efforts to see Molly again that Mrs. Gibson had anticipated on the night of the ball. That al-Nasher vision had fallen to the ground. It was as yet early morning, a delicious, fresh, lovely June day, the air redolent with the scents of flower growth and bloom, and half the time the girls had been ostensibly employed in the French reading, they had been leaning out of the open window trying to reach a cluster of climbing roses. They had secured them at last, and the buds lay on Cynthia's lap, but many of the petals had fallen off, so, though the perfume lingered about the window-seat, the full beauty of the flowers had passed away. Mrs. Gibson had once or twice reproved them for the merry noise they were making, which hindered her in the business of counting the stitches in her pattern, and she had set herself a certain quantity to do that morning before going out, and was of that nature which attaches infinite importance to fulfilling small resolutions, made about indifferent trifles without any reason whatever. "Mr. Roger Hamley," was announced. "So tiresome," said Mrs. Gibson, almost in his hearing, as she pushed away her embroidery frame. She put out her cold, motionless hand to him, with a half-murmured word of welcome, still eyeing her lost embroidery. He took no apparent notice, and passed on to the window. "How delicious," said he. "No need for any more Hamley roses, now yours are out." "I agree with you," said Mrs. Gibson, replying to him before either Cynthia or Molly could speak, though he addressed his words to them. "You've been very kind in bringing us flowers so long, but now our own are out, we need not trouble you any more." He looked at her with a little surprise clouding his honest face. It was perhaps more at the tone than the words. Mrs. Gibson, however, had been bold enough to strike the first blow, and she determined to go on as opportunity offered. Molly would perhaps have been more pained if she had not seen Cynthia's colour rise. She waited for her to speak, if need were, for she knew that Roger's defence, if defence were required, might be safely entrusted to Cynthia's ready wit. He put out his hand for the shattered cluster of roses that lay in Cynthia's lap. "At any rate," said he, "my trouble, if Mrs. Gibson considers it has been trouble to me, will be overpaid if I may have this." "Old lamps for new," said Cynthia, smiling as she gave it to him. "I wish one could always buy nosegays such as you have brought us, as cheaply." "You forget the waste of time that I think we must reckon as part of the payment," said her mother. "Really, Mr. Hamley, we must learn to shut our doors on you if you come so often, and at such early hours. I settle myself to my own employment regularly after breakfast till lunch-time, and it is my wish to keep Cynthia and Molly to a course of improving reading and study, so desirable for young people of their age, if they are ever to become intelligent, companionable women. But with early visitors it is quite impossible to observe any regularity of habits." All this was said in that sweet, false tone which of late had gone through Molly like the scraping of a slate-pencil on a slate. Roger's face changed, his ruddy colour grew paler for a moment, and he looked grave and not pleased. In another moment the wonted frankness of expression returned. Why should not he asked himself, believe her? It was early to call, it did interrupt regular occupation. So he spoke and said, "I believe I have been very thoughtless. I'll not come so early again. But I had some excuse to-day. My brother told me you had made a plan for going to see Hurst Wood when the roses were out, and they are earlier than usual this year. I've been round to see. He spoke of a long day there, going before lunch." "The plan was made with Mr. Osborne, Hamley. I could not think of going without him," said Mrs. Gibson coldly. "I had a letter from him this morning, in which he named your wish, and he says he fears he cannot be at home until they are out of flower. I dare say they are not much to see in reality, but the day is so lovely I thought that the plan of going to Hurst Wood would be a charming excuse for being out of doors." "Thank you. How kind you are, and so good, too, in sacrificing your natural desire to be with your father as much as possible." "I am glad to say my father is so much better than he was in the winter, that he spends much of his time out of doors in his fields. He has been accustomed to go about alone, and we think that as great a return to his former habits as he can be induced to make is the best for him." "And when do you return to Cambridge?" There was some hesitation in Roger's manner as he replied, "It is uncertain. You probably know that I am to be a Fellow of Cambridge now. I hardly yet know what my future plans may be. I am thinking of going up to London soon." "Ah, London is the true place for a young man," said Mrs. Gibson with decision, as if she had reflected a good deal on the question. "If it were not that we are really so busy this morning, I should have been tempted to make an exception to our general rule. One more exception, for your early visits have made us make too many already. Perhaps, however, we may see you again before you go." "Certainly I shall come," replied he, rising to take his leave, and still holding the demolished roses in his hand. Then, addressing himself more especially to Cynthia, he added, "My stay in London will not exceed a fortnight or so. Is there anything I can do for you? Or you?" turning a little to Molly. "No, thank you very much," said Cynthia very sweetly, and then, acting on a sudden impulse, she leant out of the window and gathered him some half-opened roses. "You deserve these. Do throw that poor shabby bunch away." His eyes brightened, his cheeks glowed. He took the offered buds, but did not throw away the other bunch. "At any rate, I may come over after lunch is over, and the afternoons and evenings will be the most delicious time of day a month hence." He said this to both Molly and Cynthia, but in his heart he addressed it to the latter. Mrs. Gibson affected not to hear what he was saying, but held out her limp hand once more to him. "I suppose we shall see you when you return, and pray tell your brother how we are longing to have a visit from him again." When he had left the room, Molly's heart was quite full. She had watched his face, and read something of his feelings, his disappointment at their non-acquiescence in his plan of a day's pleasure in Hurst Wood, the delayed conviction that his presence was not welcome to the wife of his old friend, which had come so slowly upon him. Perhaps, after all, these things touched Molly more keenly than they did him. His bright look when Cynthia gave him the rosebuds indicated a gush of sudden delight more vivid than the pain he had shown by his previous increase of gravity. "I can't think why he will come at such untimely hours," said Mrs. Gibson, as soon as she heard him fairly out of the house. "It's different from Osborne. We are so much more intimate with him. He came and made friends with us all the time this stupid brother of his was muddling his brains with mathematics at Cambridge. Fellow of Trinity, indeed! I wish he would learn to stay there, and not come intruding here, and assuming that because I asked Osborne to join in a picnic, it was all the same to me which brother came." "In short, mamma, one man may steal a horse, but another must not look over the hedge," said Cynthia, pouting a little. "And the two brothers have always been treated so exactly alike by their friends, and there has been such a strong friendship between them, that it is no wonder Roger thinks he may be welcome where Osborne is allowed to come at all hours," continued Molly in high dudgeon. "Roger's muddled brains, indeed! Roger stupid!" "Oh, very well, my dears.
When I was young, it wouldn't have been thought becoming for girls of your age to fly out because a little restraint was exercised as to the hours at which they should receive the young men's calls, and they would have supposed that there might be good reasons why their parents disapproved of the visits of certain gentlemen, even while they were proud and pleased to see some members of the same family." "But that was what I said, mamma," said Cynthia, looking at her mother with an expression of innocent bewilderment on her face. "One man may—" "Be quiet, child! All proverbs are vulgar, and I do believe that is the vulgarest of all. You are really catching Roger Hamley's coarseness, Cynthia." "Mamma," said Cynthia, roused to anger, "I don't mind your abusing me, but Mr. Roger Hamley has been very kind to me while I've not been well. I can't bear to hear him disparaged. If he's coarse, I've no objection to be coarse as well, for it seems to me it must mean kindliness and pleasantness, and the bringing of pretty flowers and presents." Molly's tears were brimming over at these words. She could have kissed Cynthia for her warm partisanship, but afraid of betraying emotion and making a scene, as Mrs. Gibson called any signs of warm feeling, she laid down her book hastily, and ran upstairs to her room, and locked the door in order to breathe freely. There were traces of tears upon her face when she returned into the drawing-room half an hour afterwards, walking straight and demurely up to her former place, where Cynthia still sat and gazed idly out of the window, pouting and displeased. Mrs. Gibson, meanwhile, counting her stitches aloud with great distinctness and vigour. End of Chapter 28.